Okay, what we're going to do today is we're going to look at three things. I might look at four if I've got time, but three things in particular. First thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at cyberspace and cyber culture. And in here we want to obviously make a distinction between these two terms because it's important that we look at the background of them and that we understand how they fit before we actually move on to looking at what we call brands. I've obviously made a bit of a play here of brand new worlds when it's really, use of the phrase brave new worlds. Well, cyberspace and cyber culture has a particular impact for brands and it creates brand new worlds, as we'll see. Secondly, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the rise of the cyber brand. Now, actually, you'll know a lot of this already. You'll be very familiar with it, but hopefully the first piece that we'll speak about will make sense as it links to, obviously, the second piece in these cyber brands. Thirdly, we're going to actually look at, this issue of the cyberspace and what I've called competitions of capital. In particular, I'm going to bring in Pierre Bourdieu here and his conceptions of capital. Now, I know that you've heard possibly a little bit about this before, but I think it should be useful because we're going to have to look at how notions of capital work in cyberspace. And I suppose critically ask ourselves, does this make a difference for brands? And if I get a chance, I'll maybe move on to the notions of reality, which is a bit more critical. Or I might just leave that for the actual tutorial. Okay, so those are the three things that we're actually going to do today. So let's get to the first one. Right then, as we move to have a look at this, or the first part of this, the first thing I always think about is the classic quote by Plutarch. It's a misquote really, but basically you've heard of it. It's where it says, Alexander wept because there was no more worlds to conquer. Well, that's exactly what we get when we think about cyberspace and cyber culture. The only difference is with cyberspace and cyber culture, we actually create new worlds quite literally. Now, when I say that, I think it's really important for us to get our terms right, and we need to understand the difference between the internet and the World Wide Web. Now, the internet is basically, that's the infrastructure. That's the kind of motorways or the autobahn that gives us connectivity to the web. The web layers upon the internet, okay? So you've got the infrastructure, if you like, just think of like some of the motorways that take us to all over the world, and then you have the web, which lies on top of it. Now, when we talk about the web, we're talking about basically Tim Berners-Lee. He's the guy, the real inventor, or is often attributed to the invention behind him. And what he did is he took the idea of hypertext and he connected it to transmission control protocol and domain name systems ideas. And ta-da, as he says, you get the World Wide Web. No big deal, it would seem. But the funny thing is that, as you can actually see here, by this picture of Berners-Lee, that at the time when he actually, if you like, invented this, the web itself, you see with the press's reaction, it's kind of making fun of it here. Computer web of change, will change billions of lives, and it says yeah right. That's what it says. They can't really see it, but that's what it's saying yeah right. So it's making a bit of fun of Berners-Lee. It's not a great picture, but I really like this image here because it does, show, if you like, at the time in August the 6th, 1991. That is the key date here when the web goes live, right? And the press, if you like, they're kind of making fun of it, aren't they? But bizarrely, this is where we live. This is where brands live, and it has changed brands and how we live our lives forever. And we can see it here because now we know that we actually live on the web. It challenges our identity, it challenges who we are, it actually transforms, I would suggest to you, and maybe we can talk about it later, even our conceptions of reality, of the real. Of course, so do the brands. The brands now live on the web as well. So that's just getting a distinction between, straight away, when we talk about the internet and the World Wide Web. I think it's important to just disaggregate those two terms. However, there's an interesting piece here when we actually talk about cyberspace. Cyberspace was actually a term that William Gibson here in his famous book Necromancer coined. What's interesting about Gibson's term cyberspace that we've come to know so well is that he didn't even know what the term really meant himself, not fully anyway. But he's a science fiction writer, and he got part of his inspiration from watching kids playing video games, like here. As you see here, what he actually had is Gibson was watching kids playing these video games. He was watching them, being totally absorbed by them way back in 1984 or the early 80s when he was writing his book Necromancer. And at this time, he was seeing something different taking place. But of course, for Gibson, he didn't like this. This wasn't a good thing. He saw this as he saw the term cyberspace as a dystopian term, a very negative term, a term of another way of corporate hegemony, the way that businesses, you might even say brands if you like, even back then, were starting to evolve in a different way. And again, we're trying to infiltrate the consciousness of the consumer. However, while Gibson's view is very dark and very cynical, this little clip by Neil Postman gives a slightly different, I suppose, definition of cyberspace.
Define cyberspace.
Cyberspace is a metaphorical idea which is supposed to be the space where your consciousness is located when you're using computer technology on the internet, for example. And I'm not entirely sure it's such a useful term, but I think that's what most people mean by it.
Of course, nowadays when we talk about cyberspace, okay, we're really now talking about cyber culture. And here's a great definition that you can see here from Bell. It really gives us a huge, lead in from the likes of Raymond Williams when we talk about culture as a way of life, and this idea of now we see with Frau and Morris to a network of embedded practices, representations, and it gives you a whole series of things that we mean by that. And at the very end, it nips it in the bud here by saying cyberculture therefore refers to ways of life in cyberspace. So here you get it. Cyberculture talking about cyberspaces, and in these cyberspaces, how you have a way of life. Now, what does that really mean? Well, it actually means how do we behave, how do we interact, and is that different to how you would interact, if you like, in the so-called real world? And that therefore would have a huge impact on how brands would behave in cyberspaces. So here's a wee kind of simple one to finish it off here, a wee simple example why that's just what we mean by cyberculture.